All right, hi. Thank you very much for coming and for joining the talk. I know it's the post-lunch hour and everyone is probably a little bit deflated from the food, so I'll do my best to wake you up. And in order to do that, I will regale you with a story. And our story begins on a cold winter day, very, very late in 2020. Now, I don't know how many of you actually remember 2020. Hopefully you've managed to repress it well enough. But we're talking at the height of the COVID pandemic. Specifically in my home country of Israel, we were deep into either the second or the third lockdown. I don't even remember anymore. So suffice to say, 2020 was a really, really, really bad year all around. And then I got fired. Now, you'll notice I said fired. I didn't say downsized. I didn't use any euphemism. The company wasn't shrinking. It was none of that stuff. This was personal. This was specific. I was personally fired for whatever reasons. Now, the reasons matter, and we're going to circle back to them a little bit later. But what's important for the purposes of this talk is that within days of being fired, I started my own business. And in this talk, we're going to talk a little bit about the why as well as the how. Now, I will preface this by saying this is not a prescriptive talk. I'm not going to be telling you how to start your own business necessarily, but I am going to share a little bit about my thought process, my work process, how I went about doing it, what worked, what didn't. So if the notion of getting fired and within a week starting my own business sounds obvious to you, then bear with me and I'll try to explain how. If it sounds insane, then bear with me and I'll try to explain why, right? So hopefully you won't come out of this talk knowing necessarily how to start your own business, and certainly I will not necessarily recommend doing that, but you will have some idea of what it takes to start your own business and how I personally went about doing that. So hopefully it'll be useful. Now, the second disclaimer is that everything I'm going to be talking about is extremely subjective. This is my personal journey. It's based on my own personal experiences and observation after about 2 decades in the industry. Some of this may and some of this may not apply to your own situation, your own country, your own financial situation. All of these things matter, and this is just my take on it, right? So everything I say, take with a grain of salt or a truckload of salt. Now, let's start with the why. In order to kind of get a feel for why I opted to start my own business, and it's worth noting, at that point, I was in the industry for 19 years. I was very gainfully employed. I had a reasonable work history. I was getting paid well. So basically the same as most of the people in this room, hopefully, adjusting for time. In order to understand why I opted to ditch all of that and start my own business, it would behoove us to understand a little bit about my state of mind after getting fired. And in order to do that, we'll employ a little bit of Psychology 101 with the 5 stages of grief. And it starts with denial. Now, I knew this was coming. Right? Getting fired, getting the call where I actually got fired did not come as a surprise. This is a process. This is not generally something that happens, unless you're American, probably, this is not something that happens suddenly. You know you're going to get fired, right? Whether you deserved it or not doesn't matter. It's not going to come as a surprise, and it didn't come as a surprise to me either. Furthermore, I've been there before, right? Like I said, 2 decades in the industry, I've been fired before. Fortunately, not very often. And being fired is never a pleasant experience, and in this particular case, it was an unusually unpleasant experience. But, as I mentioned, been there before, not my first rodeo. But I just could not figure it out. I couldn't wrap my head around, not the fact that I got fired, but the process that got me to that point. How did things get so bad? What was different about this experience versus every experience I've ever had in the industry up until that point that got me to the situation where I'm getting fired mid-COVID, mid-lockdown, and having to figure things out anew for my career. Now, the fact that I couldn't figure it out, the fact that I couldn't wrap my head around, honestly, it's still true. I'm still struggling with this. I'm still trying to figure out how things got so bad at that particular company, but denying the facts aren't going to change them. right? I was being let go, I was being fired, I'm gonna have to find new employment or some other situation that will allow me to continue supporting my family, paying off the mortgage, all of those wonderful things that adult human beings often have to deal with. The next thing that happened is I got really, 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 really angry. I got angry at everything. I started by being angry with my employer, my boss, right? How did this get so bad? Why was I being let go in general and specifically in the way that I did? It didn't have to be this way, right? That's what it felt like. It felt like a personal affront. It felt like someone wronged me, and I was very angry with that. I was also angry with my colleagues because being fired is never pleasant. In particular, in this case, it had to do with a lot of interpersonal conflict. Not a lot, but sufficient amount of interpersonal conflicts between myself and my colleagues. And in many cases, it felt like I just wasn't being listened to, right? My professional expertise, my professional opinion was being disregarded, and that is very frustrating. So I was also angry with my colleagues for sort of contributing to the process that got me that far. And critically, mostly, more than anything else, I was really, really angry at myself. I was angry at myself because I felt like I went sideways somewhere. I got something wrong. I couldn't figure out a way out of it. I couldn't figure out how to solve the conflicts. And I was very frustrated. I felt like I had failed. I had failed in what I was trying to accomplish with that job, which is really the same thing I was trying to accomplish with every job up until that point, which is I wanted to work with smart people on a kick-ass product that customers cared about and do a good job. That was my whole purpose in my career, and I felt like I failed at it. And then a little bit of logic seeped in, because being angry is natural, but it's not constructive. So I started thinking, I've been here before, right? I've been fired before. I've held plenty of jobs over my 20 years in the tech industry. This wasn't my first rodeo, but this time was different, right? Because up until this point, whatever the case, even if I was fired, it never felt like a personal failure. It never felt sudden. Something was different. And I could only think of two things that could have been different about this experience. One possibility, this job that I had held up until that point was different in some way from any previous job I've ever held. The other option was something was different about me. I had changed in some way I failed to notice that caused this breakdown in professional relationships with the rest of my peers. Now, if this job was different, the obvious question is, can I predict it? Like, can I look at a prospective employer that I'm interviewing with and go, okay, this thing that was different about this job and problematic about this job that I got fired from, how do I recognize it? How do I avert it? How do I avoid it with future employers? If something changed in me, the obvious question is, what can I change? What can I learn? What can I do better next time? What therapy can I go through, or training, or guidance, or whatever tool you pick can I leverage to make sure that this doesn't happen again, or at least has a much lower chance of ever happening again in my career? So those are kind of the obvious questions. Unfortunately, the answer to both of these questions for me was no. Because as a very, very smart an early industry friend of mine told me once, you really can only do your best, right? If you try as hard as you can and fail, there's not that much else you can do, right? You've done your best. And it is a pretty surprising and unpleasant experience to realize that your best just might not be good enough. And this was the case here. I've done my best. I've done my homework about the employer. I did a lot of work at that employer. I delivered value. I cared. I did everything to the best of my ability. I'm not saying I did it perfectly, because no one ever does, and certainly I'm not perfect, but I did my best, and it still crashed, right? So depression set in, right? What can I do about it this time? And then we moved to acceptance. I had to accept the fact that nothing that I could point to had changed in me. Nothing I could point to was different about this job. Basically, I'm unemployable. I have no reason to think that any future prospect of getting a job with a different employer is going to end up any differently. I had no reason to think I wouldn't be fired again in a year or 2 years. Now, don't get me wrong. I could probably go through the motions. I could interview. I could probably get hired again. I still had my reputation. There's plenty of reasons to think I could find employment. But I had every reason to think whatever employment I find is going to end up the same way. And I really, really, really did not want that. The second conclusion was, given the fact that, as I mentioned, I did my research about the company that I had worked for, I'd worked with them for a year, delivered value, all of these things, right? And it still crashed. Now I have a brand new set of trust issues because I had no idea what it is about that particular company that was wrong, right? What was it about the conflict between myself and that company that got me fired? If I can't put my finger on it, why should I trust anyone else to ever employ me and not treat me in the same way, i.e. firing me in the worst way possible, at the worst timing possible, right? Between those two things, I was literally at the end of my rope. After 19 years as a salaried employee in the tech industry, I just could not see myself ever taking up another employment opportunity again. Now, I'm not saying, that's a bit wide. I'm not saying I will never, ever be employed again. But certainly at that point, in my state of mind at that point, I just could not imagine myself taking on another job, let alone succeeding in it. So that was where I was, right? 19 years later, and I'm at the end of my career, basically. I needed to figure out what to do about it. So now that we understand a little bit about the mindset and the sort of where I was mentally after being fired, let's consider, or at least let's rationalize, which is what I did at the time, what is it that I can do, right? I didn't have financial reserves. I needed to find employment. I needed to find a source of income. I didn't have a lot of time to play with. I needed to make a decision. So, assuming I'm unemployable, first I need to figure out why, right? What weaknesses do I bring to the table that make me, to my mind, unemployable? Second is, do these weaknesses always apply, right? The fact everyone has weaknesses, right? Every single one of us coming into a job have some things they're very, very good at, some things they presumably are terrible at. Certainly, I have a few of those. Now, the question is, if I can figure out what my weaknesses are, can I find ways to either nullify those weaknesses, make them irrelevant, or maybe even turn them into strengths? That was the hope. And the third question is, what unique strengths do I bring to the table? What are the things that I actually am good at that are valuable to prospective employers that can really, really help me do a better job next time? And I'm a firm believer in, at least when it comes to myself, in introspection and brutal honesty. If you're not brutally honest with yourself, you're not really going to make a lot of progress on anything. And in my case, what I tried to do was I tried to figure out what are these conflict situations? What are the situations in my job where I ended up butting heads with my bosses, my colleagues, my whomevers, and what are the things that led to them being conflicts in the first place? And I ended up with these three categories of things to take into consideration, which is, in a conflict situation, any given conflict situation, do I have the expertise to even be in on that discussion? Do I have the authority to make a decision in that situation? And if typically I do not have the authority, do I have sort of the indirect authority, the organizational gravitas that makes people actually listen to me even though I'm not directly in a decision-making capacity? Right, this is what's often called indirect authority when we're talking about IC track careers in the industry in the last few years. And the situations ended up being arguments about technical decisions, right? Technical decisions. Do we do this or that? Do we choose this design or that design? And in those cases, usually I had the expertise to have a meaningful say. I may or may not have had the authority. That would depend on the particular project, the particular team, the particular job. And typically, certainly at that point, after many, many years in the industry and being on stage in conferences and such, typically I had sort of the respect of my peers, the organizational gravitas to actually make a meaningful contribution to the conversation. With architectural decisions, it's a little bit more murky. I typically had the expertise. I almost never had the authority. Right? For most organizations, the people with the authority to make architectural decisions are typically called architects, or at least have some sort of senior title to go along with it. And whether or not I had the organizational gravitas, again, would depend on the context, would depend on the people I worked in. With technical strategy, for instance, the canonical example for this is how do we deal with technical debt, right? The age-old question. I perceive this as a strategic question for every organization, and that is one of the things I would typically get into conflicts over. Again, I believe I had the expertise, certainly after this many years in the industry. I almost never had the authority to make strategic decisions for the organization, and whether or not I was listened to, again, would depend on the people I had in any given discussion, any particular conflict. And process decisions in many ways is the same thing, except a little bit worse, right? Process decisions are things like, what's our branching structure? How do we track issues? Should we pick, MongoDB or whatever? No, that's not a process decision. The process decisions are more vague, right? And things that are vague tend to be things where I have even less authority, and whether or not people listen to me also was very, very context dependent. What's important is this is the danger zone, right? When a technical decision is to be made and I don't have the authority, this is where conflict sometimes happened. With all of the other types of conflicts, they would often happen because I had strong opinions, whether or not they were backed up by like any real thinking. And I did not typically have the direct authority, and I had very murky kind of indirect authority in the organization. These are the situations that were a danger to me personally. These are the situations in which I ended up in conflict situations that would sooner or later lead to this annoying equation on the screen here. Murky authority, i.e., I did not have the formal authority from the organization, plus caring, emotional investment, giving a damn about the end result of whatever it is that was under discussion, ended up with a lot of conflict and a lot of frustration. And this has been a recurring theme in my entire career up until that point. This, for me, is the danger zone. So I came up with a few hypotheses. Right? I was looking at this and trying to figure out, okay, these are my weaknesses, these are the situations I need to either avoid or find a completely different angle of attack on. What are some things I can assume that would help me break out of this very, very frustrating and depressing situation that I was in? Now, my hypotheses ended up being these. Emotional investment is not prerequisite to doing a good job. Now, we all want to work with people that care. We all try to hire people that are enthusiastic about the work, enthusiastic about the tech. We all ask questions about the products from our prospective hires, trying to suss out whether or not they're actually interested in what the company is doing, right? We want to work with people that care about the work and care about the company and care about the product. My hypothesis is that this isn't actually a prerequisite to doing a great job. And proving that was going to be challenging, but that was an assumption I made. The other hypothesis is that in some cases, caring is actually counterproductive. Caring too much is a liability. If you care too much, if you care about the end result, you might get into arguments. Those arguments might grow into conflict, and you may end up getting fired, right? So emotional investment, for me personally, might actually be something to be wary of, something to find a way to cap, to put an upper bound on how much I actually care so that I don't get into those heated arguments. And the third hypothesis is that organizational gravitas can actually be artificially created, by which I mean, you walk into a meeting, there's a bunch of people in the room. How likely are they to actually listen to what you have to say? Now, that depends on a lot of things, but my hypothesis was this. If I'm in the room as an employee, I'm in the room as a peer. That is to say, if I don't have authority, I'm not more or less likely to be listened to than anyone else in the room, irrespective of what else I bring to the table. The fact that I have experience or expertise or knowledge of a particular domain does not necessarily translate to being taken seriously in an argument. My theory is that putting money on the table, in other words, if a particular company brings me in specifically into that meeting, specifically to provide that voice, that lends all the gravitas I need. Or put more cynically, your boss put money on the table for me to be here, ignore me at your peril, right? You're wasting your company's money. Your company put good money for me to be here and lend my expertise. If you're not taking it seriously, that's not my problem, that's not on me, but it may become your problem, right? It's a very cynical way of looking at it, but that was the hypothesis. Now, looking at these three things, the counter-argument is that the reason companies hire people and go through the motions of interviewing and hiring and putting out those contracts and signing the contracts, there's really two reasons why this is done. The first is it creates a personal stake with the employee, right? If you're signing an employment contract, you're getting your compensation package, you're getting your stock options, your whatever. All of these things are designed so that you have some kind of high personal stake in the company, in the work that you're doing. On the other hand, what the company gets out of it is the presumption that it can trust you. If we've vetted our employees, if we interviewed them, hired them, signed a contract with them, made it harder for us to get rid of them on the one hand, and made it harder for them to ignore us on the other hand, then there is some presumption of trust, right? An employee with a contract with a company has a higher baseline of trust as far as the company is concerned than anyone who isn't a salaried employee. Now, trust is a core concept here, because without trust, there's no leverage. Without trust, without the organization trusting you to make decisions for the good of the company, for the good of the business, you're not going to be able to move anything within the organization. You're not going to be able to make decisions. You're not going to be able to impact the bottom line or the way things are done. Trust is how organizations mitigate risk, right? We're not going to let anyone make a potentially impactful decision on the organization if we don't have a high level of trust. One way to generate that is an employment contract. So, looking at this, what is it that's actually required? If these things are met, another hypothesis, if these four elements exist, then trust exists, things can actually happen. Decisions can be made, conflicts can be resolved. Customers, I'll be reading off of this a little bit, customers basically need to trust four things. They need to trust me personally in this case, but any employee, to actually do the job, right? If you give someone an assignment, they don't actually do the assignment, that's a breach of trust. They need to trust my professional judgment, otherwise I'm not actually capable of delivering any real value to that company, to that prospective customer. They need to trust my conduct, because nothing breaks willingness to work with people more than them doing something, wronging you in some way. And they need to trust that I have their best interests at heart, because otherwise they're not going to trust my professional judgment. So all these elements of trust are really, really, really core. In fact, I would say that trust is the real challenge. If I'm not employed at a company, can I generate the level of trust that's necessary to get good results for the company, income for me, and a win-win situation for everyone involved? And in effect, this was the core decision. I had decided at this point that if I'm unemployable, but I believe that I'm good at my job, in order to actually be able to deliver that value, I'm going to build my own business, and I'm going to build it around trust. I'm going to try to generate a situation in which, although I don't have an employment contract with a company, and they can't, trust me in the same way that they trust someone who is an employee and has an employment contract, if I can nail that, if I can generate that trust, the assumption was I can actually win, right? I can actually deliver value, I can get paid. Everyone will be happy, and conflicts will be averted. And that was what I set out to do, right? I started with trying to figure out what it is that went wrong, trying to figure out what it is that is needful as far as organizations are concerned, and build a business to deliver that. And this is more of the how section. This is how I went about building my business. So the plan of attack was really pretty straightforward, right? First thing is actually set up a business. What does it mean to set up a business? What do I need from a practical and administrative standpoint? The second is marketing, which is to say I need to figure out how to put myself out there, how to generate the sort of visibility that I need in order to get customers and get prospective customers to actually be interested in the business that I'm building. Pricing, which is a really gnarly element of being independent, and then actually doing the work, invoicing, and making a good profit. That was the theory. How do you get started, right? You decided, for whatever reason, to start your own business. Obviously, the practical reality of starting a business is going to look very, very different depending on which country you're in, what laws are in effect, what are the regulations that are in place for you as an individual starting a business. So I'm not going to be talking about any of that because, again, it looks very, very dissimilar from country to country. I'm assuming even in Europe, within the EU, there are massive differences between starting a business in Germany versus Spain or France or Poland. Instead, let's talk about the core elements of bringing a business to life. So the first thing that you have to do is pick a name for your business, right? You can call the business by your name if you're doing a solo act. Like if you're a consultant, you don't necessarily have to have a brand. For me, it was important for two reasons. One is my name is weird and unwieldy because I'm from Israel and very few people can pronounce it right. But more importantly, I didn't want to limit myself to being a solo act. Now, I will say 3 years later, I'm still a lone wolf. I'm still working by myself. That may or may not change in the future. But that is not a decision I had ever consciously made. I did not decide to build a one-man show. I started as a one-man show, and I may end up as a one-man show. But I did not want to limit myself to that. So I actually did want to build a proper brand. And I picked the name Substrate, which comes from Latin, substratum, an underlying support or foundation. In other words, a substrate is the thing that you build your thing on top of, right? It is an element, a foundational element in how you build the thing that is generally invisible to any of the people using your product, visiting your building, whatever context you come out of. The next thing to do is to sort out the basics. Now, this is the stuff I'm not going to be talking about much. You probably need some sort of licensed dealer or to incorporate as a business. You need to hire some kind of legal help. You probably need a CPA to deal with invoicing and taxes and stuff. By hardware, by software, all of these things differ from country to country, business to business. We're not going to be talking about this. What we are going to be talking about is this. This is the big one, formalizing the business goals and the business philosophy. What am I building? What is this? Given that I'm not building a product company, right? I'm not an entrepreneur. This is not a startup. This is a consulting business for the purposes of delivering value to other customers. So figuring out how I'm going to go about it was key to, per my thinking, is key to the success of the business. So the first thing I did was to start with kind of a two-pager. Right? I opened up Google Doc and I started typing it in. Right? I'm starting a business. I chose the name for the business. What makes it unique? What is this business? What does it do? What services does it provide? What sets it apart from any of the other people in this room potentially that would start their own competing business? Right? What do I bring to the table that makes this consulting business unique or interesting? And what are the core values? What are the things that I care about in running my own business that I'm not going to compromise on whatever else I do? I chose these three, right? This is the nebulous corporate mission statement part of the talk, except it's not, because whereas with a big corporation, you might have 7 or 11 corporate values, and over 2,000 people in the company, everyone kind of interprets it differently. That doesn't bring a lot of value. In this case, these are the core idioms of my business. These are the things without which my business will not be the thing I want it to be, and my customers will not actually get the value that I promised them. Care. And these are direct quotes from that 2-page overview document that, by the way, is linked. Everything is public. You can, if you're interested or if you're trying to get some kind of inspiration as to how to potentially do it on your own, it's all out there. This is a very simple statement. We will not, under any circumstances, screw our customers over. You'll notice the we. Like I mentioned, I did not build a solo business, and it may or may not end up having multiple consultants working for it. But this is a core thing, right? I want my customers to know that no matter what happens, they will either break even or get value out of working with me. Integrity. Always be truthful, never lie. If I promise something, the assumption when making that promise is I can deliver on that promise. I will never promise something I can't deliver. I will never tell you, oh, I can do this when I have no idea how to do this. I will always be fully transparent and fully honest in the things that I bring to the table with customers. So for instance, this little bit of text is what allows me 3 years later to have a conversation with a prospective customer and go, look, if you ask me about security stuff, I can quote the OWASP, top 10 security things along with every other developer on the planet. I can do that as well as anyone. I have no expertise in security. I will not do anything stupid. I will be conscientious about the work that I do, but I'm not a security expert, which is why if you, as a business, as a prospective customer, are interested, for instance, are in a tightly regulated industry, and you need someone with security expertise to go over your system, I will help you find that person. I will help you work with that person. I will not be that person for you because that's not the domain knowledge that I bring to the table. Right? So that kind of honesty and transparency is a very, very core value in the business that I'm trying to build. The third core value is craftsmanship. Throughout my career, I cared very, very deeply about what I do. I cared about the quality, the end result of the work that I do. Now, it's easy to say everyone cares about the quality of the work that I do, except not everyone makes that the leading first, second, or third item on the agenda. For many, many employees, many, many businesses, and I'm not saying that in a judgmental way, right? There is a trade-off, quality versus time versus money. That's a trade-off, right? This is the trade-off that I choose to make. Quality comes first. If the solution is not high quality, I'm not going to deliver it. I would rather give you your money back than do shit work. That is essentially it, right? And these core values matter because, as I mentioned, these are the 4 things that my customers, prospective customers, will need to trust me with. And these 3 core values map directly. If I care about the work that I do, then my customers can, if I can prove that I care enough, my customers will trust me to do the job that I do. And they will trust me to have their best interests in mind because I care. I'm not going to simply do the work that a customer is asking me to do if, in my professional judgment, that is not the right decision for the customer. I'm going to advocate for a different solution, right? And hopefully, because I bring expertise to the table, they're going to listen to me. And if not, then suddenly I don't have the emotional involvement that requires me to walk in there and have an argument, right? That lessens the conflict. Integrity maps to these 2 things, right? Conduct is important. One of the most common complaints about consultants is that they're unreliable. You can't trust them to do the work necessarily. They might go away without warning. On the other hand, you can't trust them to have your interests. They're in it for the money. They're in it to do the work. If given the option between doing the stupid thing that takes 20 billable hours or doing the smart thing that takes 2 billable hours, your consultant will opt for the more lucrative 20-hour billing cycle. Then that is not the value I want to deliver to my customers. I want them to be able to trust that I want their success, right? That is the core business proposition. Craftsmanship, again, ties into best interest and ties into professional judgment. So it all circles around trust, right? That is the core challenge that the business is aimed at attacking. Now, branding ties into this very, very deeply. Branding actually ties into everything very deeply. Now, if you're starting a consulting business and you have some kind of reputation in the industry, you can just put your name as a consultant and probably get hired fairly well. But your prospective customers don't know you. Even if you have a reputation, whomever it is that you talk to, let's say you get recommended by someone you worked with to their friend, like they're still going to look you up because they don't know you personally. They don't know that they can trust you. The first thing they do is Google you. The second thing they do, they read stuff about you. Are you competent? Do you have the reputation of someone who delivers and gets shit done? They'll try to suss you out. And first impressions are everything. If your prospective customer Googles you and finds either a crappy or outdated website, or they find badly worded blog posts that you wrote 6 years ago for like some sort of corporate blog, right? That doesn't look good. You want the first impression that a customer gets to quote unquote sell what it is you bring to the table, because you're not going to get a second chance. And finally, there are only 24 hours in the day. So you can't do everything. No matter who you are, no matter what it is you do in the industry, you don't have the time to take care of everything. What you choose to focus on, what you choose to spend your time on, is as visible as the results of your work. Right? If you, for instance, as an engineer, if you talk about quality all the time, then that is something you choose to focus on, which means that if someone comes along and just wants a cheap throwaway prototype to showcase something, then you might not be the right choice for them, right? Because you focus on quality. They don't care about quality in that particular context, right? So that matching of expectations between whatever it is your prospective customer needs and what you showcase indirectly as you're being Googled for, right? That matching of expectations is super important, not just to getting the customers in the first place, but to also set the expectations for the entirety of the business transaction. So branding is super, super, super important. In my case, that is the second thing I dealt with. The first thing was, why am I building this business? What do I value? The second thing was actually put together a design brief. I hired a graphics designer and someone with experience in building building brands and building a design language and visual assets for brands. And I put together a fairly long-winded document that explained what it is that I want my customers to see, irrespective of what artifact of mine they end up. So the idea is that if one of my prospective customers ends up looking at this presentation, or ends up looking at a document, or ends up looking at a website of mine, or my company's Twitter account, or even the code that I write as part of the job, they should have a similar experience of what it is that I value, right? What visually am I trying to convey here, right? What does my brand shout when you look at it? My logo, my design, my website, the wording, the text, etc. All of these things come together to give an impression. And that impression must be congruent with who you actually are and the sort of business practices that you actually put in place. Otherwise, you have a case of mismatched expectations. Your customers are not going to be happy with you. So to my mind, these things are all tied together, right? The visual design, the graphics assets, the landing site for my company, the business name, the way I do business, the way I do work, all of these things are intended to convey the same message, which is I care about quality for my personal business, right? I care deeply about quality. I do stuff that is not necessarily visible to your customers, but is going to be very, very meaningful or detrimental to the success of your own enterprise and endeavor. And again, going back to the trust issue, I will work with you so that it's a win for you, and at the worst case, and this is something I put front and center, no unhappy customers. That is a core tenet of my business. I will give you back the money you paid me if I can deliver value. And that is a full-blown promise I'm very happy to make publicly because it's congruent with my business, right? I deliver quality work. If you don't want quality work, if you want cheap or fast, there's nothing wrong with that, and it might fit your business perfectly, but I'm not the consultant for you, right? So branding touches everything and basically creates that expectation setting with your prospective customers. Pricing, oddly enough, ties into that as well. Pricing actually tells a lot about your business. There are two canonical ways of doing pricing in this industry, right? For every given piece of work, when you hire a consultant or a company or whatever, you typically work in one of two modes. You either work at an hourly rate, whether it's an hour bank or not, all of these are variations on a theme. Basically, you either define the scope of the work you're trying to accomplish, you give an estimate, but then you work on an hourly basis, or you do it on a project basis. So for an hourly rate, there are advantages. It's really, really simple and straightforward to track. Your customers, you start a timer, your customers know how much work you've done, they know how much they're going to be paying you, and they can halt the work at any point, right? If they decide that the work isn't for them, or that it takes too long, it costs too much, whatever, they can stop at any point. There's very low risk for everyone involved. On the other hand, it's very linear. Right? If you work on an hourly basis, the maximum amount of money you can make is how many hours in the day times how much you get paid for an hour, and that's all there is to it. So there's low risk, but there's no opportunity for more than linear scaling, and there's no opportunity to expand your margins. This is what it is. Contrary-wise, if you work on a project basis, that is to say, you have a customer, they need something from you, you tell them this is going to cost however many thousands of dollars, and I will deliver by this date, and that's the project, and you sign off on everything in advance, with or without milestones. It's very easy for the customer to plan for. They know how much money they're going to be spending on that particular feature or product or whatever it is that they're hiring you to do. So there is no opportunity for things to blow out of proportion as far as the client is concerned, right? They don't care if it takes you 10 hours or 20 hours, they've paid for however many, and that's it. It can improve your margins as a consultant. If you sell a product for, a product. If you estimate something at being 10 hours and that's what your customer is paying for and it took you 1 hour, then your margins have increased dramatically. On the other hand, estimation, as you know, in this industry, is notoriously hard. Estimating software projects is something we all suck at. We all suck at really, really, really badly. And we've all come to accept it and try to find ways of dealing with it, like iterative development, small chunking of work, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are ways to better the estimates. Now, when you're an employee, usually those estimates don't matter beyond just the planning phase. Right? If you estimate something at being 3 days or 3 story points and it takes you a week, you're not going to get fired for that. At most, you're going to get a slap on the wrist and be asked to provide better estimates next time. But here we have a business risk. Right? You're estimating something that you don't really know how to estimate, and there's money tied to that estimation. And there's a very, very high risk of blowout. So one thing that can happen is your customer pays for 10 hours and you only end up taking 1. The other thing that can happen is your customer pays for 10 hours, but it takes 40, right? Both sides are at risk here. So you have a decision to make. How do you want to work? In my case, I'm willing to work with any customer in any way that they see fit. But my recommendation, both to prospective consultants and to my customers, is go with an hourly rate. It's not fun, it's linear, it's sometimes unpredictable, but it's really, really, really easy. And that coupled with, hey, if you're not happy, I'm just gonna give you your money back, means my customers are very happy to take that risk because they have an escape hatch out of that risk at any given time. And it makes it really easy to track, really easy to invoice, and no one is sitting there wondering, did I overpay for this? And on the other hand, you're not going to be sitting there working on something and being frustrated that this is taking way more time and it's money out of pocket. Right? So again, it works for me, that's my recommendation, but there is no single truth to that. How much should you charge? Like, assuming you go with an hourly rate, how do you even determine what the hourly rate should be? How do you decide how much to charge your customers? Well, these are the 4 things that determine that, right? The market value of your skills, your reputation, how much your client actually values the work that you do, and can they even pay you? What is their financial situation? My recommendation is pretty straightforward. You're presumably starting off as a salaried employee. Take that salary, add the employee cost, things like pension fund, vacation days, sick days, all of these things. For Israel, it's about 40%. I've heard other numbers for other countries, but it's always in that ballpark. Between 30 and 50% on top of your salary is what you cost your employer, right? So take that number, divide it by the realistic number of billable hours you have in a month, and there's a lot of dead time as a salaried employee that you don't even notice, right? The canonical number is like 200 or 220 work hours per month. That's bullshit. If you do 120 hours of real work per month, you're doing very, very, very well. In my experience, 120 is a good ballpark number. Take those numbers, plug them in, you get a number out of them. That's a good number to start with. Your reputation as a business starts at basically nil, so pricing will have to reflect that. You will probably start getting paid considerably lower than your salary would have been. It's just the reality of it. You can increase it as you go. These 2 things, how the client views the work and what their financial situation is, you have no control over, you can't know in advance, it just is what it is. And because we're running out of time, I'm going to quickly talk about this thing, which is finding your first customer. It depends. There is no one way to go about it. In my case, I was lucky. I had 20 years of past experiences working with people, speaking on stage, etc. I did organic networking without intending to, networking in the tech industry sense. And through that network, I got my first customer, my second customer, and through them, my third and fourth, and so on. So there's no prescribed way of doing it. It is what it is. So these basically are the key takeaways here. This isn't for everyone. Freelancing is, especially as a solo act, it's a very lonely thing. You have to deal with a lot of things that you wouldn't have to deal with as a salaried employee. It's not for everyone. If you're thinking about it seriously, do some serious introspection, figure out what works for you as a salaried employee and what doesn't, and just recognize that there's no one true way of doing things. Okay, you're gonna have to experiment, you're gonna have to figure it out, and you are more than welcome to talk to me if you need any advice or have any questions that you want answered, because unfortunately we are also out of time. With that, thank you very much for your attention. I hope this was at least mildly entertaining or interesting, and you know where to find me for any questions, follow-ups, or prospective business arrangements. Thank you very, very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a great day.